to see you again.
Yes, very good to see you.
How is everything?
It's slowly. It's fine. It's really nice that you could join us today.
Oh, it is my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, we are based in Denmark, and Denmark is slowly opening up, and so many things are going back to normal. So it's a very, very different situation as it was before.
Okay.
Yes.
Very good. In the U.S., we will open up in 2025 at the rate that Americans are listening to scientific information. So I wish you well, and I hope to get over there before we are able to walk around again here.
Yes, but I would like also to introduce you to our also maybe the audience. I don't know if everybody here who is joining us today know you, but of course, yeah, I would like just to say a few things that we met first in Copenhagen. Where Time Perspective Network was hosting our third international conference on time perspective, and Sheldon came over and gave a very interesting talk, also thought-provoking, and so Sheldon Solomon is a professor of psychology at Skidmore College, New York, and is mainly interested in, well, we will talk more, but that's what at least we understand, and a psychological function of self-esteem and the effects of human awareness of death on thoughts, feelings, and behavior. And so today we will talk about this very uniquely human fear of death, and which has this a great effect on our own thoughts, feelings, and behavior. And also this question, so how do we manage this terror of death under normal conditions? And actually, what are the implications of these notions for managing our terror now in this interesting times that we are all living and find ourselves in these times of Corona? And so I think it's going to be a very interesting and thought-provoking talk and discussion. I think we can take some questions over the chat. And I don't know, Sheldon, do you prefer to answer them as you go or after your talk?
Well, Anna, because I am a fossil from the last century, I am just getting used to this technology. So my guess is that I will do better. I'm happy to answer questions anytime, but I don't know that I'll be very good at noticing them.
I will take a look at the chat.
Yeah, how about that? I don't. It seems like there seem to be 24 or so people with us right now. I guess I would just encourage people to jump in if they have a question. Does that sound all right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
We have Catherine. You're sharing a screen. Is that intentional?
Oh no, we just have our video turned off. It's Catherine. It's Jeff Schimmel.
Hey, how's it going?
So then I can stop. There we go. Perfect. Okay, but also I think in the meantime, if we can all mostly mute ourselves, and then if you have a question, then I will kind of we'll take it from there, so that otherwise not to have a lot of disturbances in the network. Sheldon, so if you want to go.
Yeah, certainly. Maybe because I'm at a bit of a disadvantage in that this is my first visit to your group. How about if I try to just give you a short overview of our ideas, and then we'll talk a little bit about the research that we've done that provides support for them. And I just as Anna proposed, I'll talk a bit about how we manage existential terror routinely, and then we can switch our attention to how this might help us understand what's happening right now in the midst of the pandemic. And let's try that and see how that goes. My work, along with my colleagues Jeff Greenberg and Tom Pazinski at the University of Arizona and Colorado, respectively, we go back 40 years. We're experimental social psychologists. And in 1980, I had an accident. I was walking in the library and I noticed a book title that caught my eye. And it was a book called The Denial of Death by a cultural anthropologist, Ernest Becker, who won a Pulitzer Prize, ironically, a few weeks after he himself died from cancer, which he didn't realize he had while he was writing the book, The Denial of Death. That's just a fact, but it's an interesting one. And what Becker argued in that book was that the uniquely human awareness of death exerts a pervasive influence on everything that people do, whether we're aware of it or not. And mainly what he argued is that we're not aware of it. And we're not because we go to extraordinary lengths to deny and deflect that unwelcome realization. Let me back up a little bit. What Becker said that he was hoping to do was to come up with a broad account of the motivational underpinnings of human behavior. As he put it in another book called The Birth and Death of Meaning, in the first paragraph of that book, he said, I want to understand why people do what they do when they do it. And I remember 40 years ago saying, yeah, me too, dude. That's what I want to understand. And then what he said is, okay, if we want to understand human behavior writ large, we need to ask two evolutionary questions at the same time. How are people very similar to every other thing that's alive? And how are we distinctly and uniquely different? And just following Darwin, he said, well, in some ways, we're no different than any other living creature. We're biologically constructed to survive in the interests of self-preservation as well as reproduction. And in that regard, we're no different than zebras or trees. On the other hand, Darwin was certainly not a fool, and he recognized that there's lots of different ways to stay alive and persist over time. And he pointed out, somewhat obviously, following Darwin, this is Becker, that one of the things that distinguishes us as human beings is that we've got a very well-developed forebrain, and this gives us the capacity to think abstractly and symbolically to the point where human beings can literally imagine something that doesn't yet exist and then turn that into reality. And I think we can all agree that that's very handy for staying alive. Every other creature has to accept the world in the form in which they encounter it. If we don't like reality, we can just change it in accord with how we would prefer it to be. Well, so what? What Becker does is to then go back in time and to think about Kierkegaard, the existential philosopher, who said that we're so smart that we actually realize that we exist. Today in psychology, we would call this self-awareness or consciousness. And Kierkegaard's point is that we take self-awareness for granted because that's our default mental state. But what he argued is that only humans are fully and explicitly self-aware because it takes a tremendous amount of cognitive capacity to render yourself the object of your own subjective inquiry. And according to Kierkegaard, once you're smart enough to know that you're here, that gives rise to two uniquely human emotions that Kierkegaard called awe and dread, respectively. All right, the good news is that it's awesome to be alive and to know it. And even though we're only going to spend another 30 seconds on this idea, let's be sure that we relish that important aspect of the human experience. There is something sublimely beautiful about being alive and knowing it. And that's good. On the other hand, Kierkegaard turns right around and says, yeah, but it's also dreadful to be smart enough to know that you're here. Also entails the horrifying realization that, like all living things, your life is of finite duration, and that you too will someday die. All right, not only do you realize that death is inevitable, you realize that it can occur at any time for reasons that you can never anticipate or control. And then, just to kind of kick us in the psychological groin, Becker adds to that. We don't like that we're going to die. We don't like that we can walk outside and get hit by a meteor or smote by a virus. We also don't like that we're embodied animals, breathing pieces of defecating meat that are no more significant or enduring than lizards or potatoes. And what Becker argues is that if that's the only thing that you thought about, I'm going to die, I'm a breathing piece of meat, I could walk outside and get killed by a sniper, you wouldn't be able to stand up in the morning. You would be overwhelmed by debilitating existential terror. That what Becker proposed is that human beings manage existential terror by embracing culturally constructed belief systems. Becker called them cultural worldviews, beliefs about reality that we share with our fellow human beings that minimizes death anxiety by giving us each a sense that we're persons of value in a world of meaning. And so those are two big terms for Becker, meaning and value. And he says, well, all right, let's talk about meaning. And let's notice that there's a lot of different cultures on the planet, present, past, and future. And they may appear superficially quite different, but they all have common attributes. Every culture has an account of the origin of the universe. Every culture has a prescription for how we're supposed to behave while we're here. And every culture has hopes of immortality, either literal immortality, the heavens, the souls, the afterlives, and reincarnations of all of the world's great religions, or symbolic immortality. You may not believe that you're going to be here forever, but be comforted by the fact that some vestige of your existence will persist nonetheless, maybe from having kids, maybe from amassing great fortunes, maybe by doing something significant like producing a great work of art or science. The point that Becker makes, and to me it's almost common sense masquerading as psychological insight, is that in order to stand up in the morning with any kind of psychological equanimity, we have to believe that life has meaning. Right? That's necessary but not sufficient, because in addition to the sense that life has meaning, we also need to believe that we as individuals are uniquely valuable in the context of the meaningful cosmological drama to which we subscribe. And the way that culture allows for us to feel meaningful and valuable is through the provision of social roles that have associated standards. If we meet or exceed them, then we're lucky enough to perceive ourselves as persons of value in a world of meaning. And so if you're a nurse, your job is to keep people alive. If you're a soldier, it's to keep people dead. If you're the goalie for the football team, your job is to keep the ball from coming into the net. If you're a banker, your job is to make money, and so on and so forth. And when you do perceive yourself as a person of value in a world of meaning, Becker called that self-esteem, not to be confused with pathological narcissism, which is the absence of self-esteem. But his point, in a proverbial nutshell, is that it is through the belief that you are a person of value in a world of meaning that we are able to minimize or manage death anxiety. Consequently, what he hypothesizes is that our primary motivation for most of our waking or even sleeping hours is to maintain confidence in our culturally constructed beliefs and faith in our value in the context of them. All right, so that's Becker's ideas so far. Any questions just about that before we launch into how we know whether or not he's full of shit? Anybody? Okay, awesome. And again, feel free to jump in. I'm going to trust that Anna's paying a bit of attention, and I hope that made sense so far. All right, so now the question is, well, there's two questions. One is, so what? And the other is, how do we know if any of this is true? And the so what question in my world as an experimental psychologist has to do with conceptual power. To put that another way, what can I understand if I provisionally accept these ideas that would be difficult or impossible to comprehend otherwise? So that's one question. It's like, all right, Becker wrote a book. Actually, he wrote 12 or 14 books, and I read them all, and you should also. But if you don't have time, I think I summarized them pretty well in the last 10 minutes. But the point is that he has these ideas. Do they provide any explanatory power? And then the second point is, how do we know if this is true? Ernest Becker won a Pulitzer Prize for the book The Denial of Death, but he couldn't get a job as a professor when he was alive. His ideas were dismissed as kind of ravingly speculative, philosophical, and psychodynamic gibberish, frankly. And in the early 1980s, when I used to go around the United States and Europe and talk about these ideas, a lot of people found them interesting, but not psychologists. They just said stuff like, well, I'm not afraid of death, so obviously your ideas are stupid. And of course, we would say, well, you're not afraid of death because you're comfortably ensconced in a cultural worldview that gives you a sense of meaning and value. So am I right or am I right? But that's not a way to win an intellectual argument. And other people just said, well, look, there's no evidence for these ideas, and therefore we won't consider them in the absence of that evidence. All right, now, I wish we had more time, because even though I'm an experimental scientist, if we had another few more hours, I'd be happy to explain why that's a kind of intellectual fascism in its own right, when you're unwilling to accept the merits of an idea in the absence of a chart with statistics on it that you don't even understand. But be that as it may, what we've been doing for the last 40 years is to collect empirical evidence in support of these claims. All right, so what I want to do fairly quickly, let me just bounce through some of the different areas of inquiry that we have worked in over the years. And I'll do that at the same time that I tell you a little bit about the experimental paradigms that we've developed in order to study these phenomena. And then that'll get us into where we really want to be today, which is, well, what might happen in light of the pandemic. All right, so thing number one is that 40 years ago, what I was interested in is how come people can't get along with other people who don't share their beliefs about reality. We were originally interested just in prejudice and ethnic violence. Why has it been the case that ever since day one, the history of humanity is one ongoing genocidal atrocity juxtaposed with the brutal subjugation of designated in-house inferiors? And Becker's answer is a very simple one. It's more complicated than I will articulate today, but the simple explanation will serve for our purposes. And it is as follows. If my beliefs about reality serve to minimize death anxiety, then whenever I encounter somebody who is different, whether I'm aware of it or not, I have a problem. let's say that I believe God created the earth in 6 days, and I run into somebody from the South Pacific in Borneo, and they believe the earth was created out of a giant coconut. Well, if the pina colada people are right, then I must be wrong. And his point is that if you accept the validity of another conception of reality, you necessarily undermine the confidence with which your own beliefs can be maintained. And this exposes you to the very anxiety that your beliefs were erected to mitigate in the first place. And so, what Becker said is that when we run into people who are different, we tend to belittle or denigrate them. We try to convince them or coerce them into getting rid of their beliefs and accepting ours instead. And if that doesn't work, just fucking kill those people, thus proving that your beliefs and your God are superior after all. And in fact, in Becker's last book, Escape from Evil, he literally says that most of the evil in the world is the result of people self-righteously claiming that they're going to rid the world of evil. All right, so now how do we know if any of this is, quote, true? Well, we developed a very simple paradigm. It's called the Mortality Salience paradigm. And in English, what it involves is reminding people that they're going to die. And so sometimes we bring people into the lab and we have them fill out a bunch of questionnaires. And then while they're doing that, right in the middle of it is 2 open-ended questions. Please jot down your thoughts and feelings about your own death, and think about what you might be thinking or feeling at the moment that you die. It's just to remind you that you're going to die. We have other ways of making people aware of death. In another manifestation of this paradigm, we do the work outside the lab, and we stop people either right in front of a funeral parlor or 100 meters to either side. And our thought is that when you're standing in front of a funeral parlor, that death is on your mind, whether you're aware of it or not. All right, then we have another way of doing this. If you come to my office in New York, you're all welcome to visit when we can move around again. You can read your email on my computer. And while you're doing that, I'll flash the word death for 48 milliseconds, so fast that you don't see anything. And the point is, and there's now more than 1,000 published studies. We haven't done all of them. That's even better because lots of other people have done this work. Is it doesn't matter how you remind people that they're going to die, the effects are the same. All right, and so the argument is that when we remind people of their own mortality, that's going to make them cling more tenaciously to their culturally constructed belief systems. And we're going to be able to measure that by assessing their reactions to other people. And very simply, what we predict is that when you're reminded of your mortality, you're going to like people who are similar to you and who share your beliefs a lot more. And you're going to hate and hurt people who have different beliefs. And that's indeed what we find. So when Christians in the United States are reminded of their mortality, they like other Christians a lot more, and they hate Jewish people. But when Jewish people in Israel are reminded that they're going to die, they love Jewish people, and they hate Christians and Arabs. Ditto all over the world. The Indians in India reminded of death. They love Indians. They hate Pakistanis. Australian Aborigines reminded of death. They hate white people in Australia, and they love Aborigines. It's not only an attitudinal effect, though. Germans reminded of their mortality sit closer to people who look German, and they sit further away from people who look like Turkish immigrants. Iranians reminded of their mortality become more supportive of suicide bombing against Western targets and are more willing to become a suicide bomber. Americans reminded of their mortality are more eager to use nuclear and chemical weapons against countries who pose no direct threat to us. Right, so one line of research that we've done is to just help us understand how existential anxieties underlie and amplify our antipathy to people who are different. I like how George Bernard Shaw put it in one of his plays when he said, when the angel of death sounds his trumpet, the pretenses of civilization are blown from men's heads into the mud like hats in a gust of wind. All right, so that's one area. How come we hate other people? Another area that I believe to be incredibly relevant for today is how existential anxieties influence political preferences. Some of you may remember, not because we were here then, but Max Weber, the German sociologist, who at the beginning of the 20th century said that in times of historical upheaval, like wars and famines and depressions, when existential fears are apt to be aroused, that we tend to embrace a certain kind of political leader. Weber called those leaders charismatic leaders. He's the guy who coined that term. Seemingly larger than life individuals who are often believed or who claim that they are divinely ordained to rid the world of evil. And in Becker's books, he writes about the rise of Hitler in terms of death anxiety, fostering a preference for charismatic leaders. Hitler was elected somewhat, and at a time when Germany was in extraordinary distress in the aftermath of World War I. And he promised to make Germany great again and to be the only one who was able to do it. Shortly after September 11th, 2001, President George W. Bush went from the lowest approval rating in presidential history in the US to the highest approval rating. And we did a dozen or so studies in 2004 showing that Americans did not like George W. Bush in controlled conditions. They liked Senator John Kerry a lot more than Bush, except if you reminded them that they were going to die first. And then they liked Bush a whole lot more. I fast forward to 2016. I don't know how much you all pay attention to what's happening in the U.S., but we have President Donald Trump. I call him Orange Hitler, and I mean it with all of the negative affect and indictment of his character that the term implies, because he ran for president saying, I am the only one who can keep you safe from the immigrants that are storming your border, forgetting about the fact that illegal immigration was at an all-time low. He's like, I'm the only one that can keep you safe from terrorists, forgetting that you're more likely to die in the US by falling in your bathroom than by a terrorist. And so be that as it may, but the point is we did the same experiments. And sure enough, in controlled conditions, Americans liked Hillary Clinton a lot more than Donald Trump, except if you reminded them of their mortality first, in which case support for now President Trump goes way up. And in fact, it's more than that, because in our other studies, what we've shown is that in America, if you just ask somebody to think about an immigrant moving into their town or a mosque being built in their neighborhood, that increases unconscious death anxiety, and that in turn increases support for President Trump. Now, we can talk more about the present moment in a bit, but for the moment, if you do pay attention to what's up in the U.S., that's why it's incredibly important for President Trump to keep blubbering about immigrants and blaming the Chinese. He needs to keep death anxiety as high as possible. I don't know that he needs any help. The pandemic is keeping it pretty high in its own right. All right, so helps us explain why we hate other people, helps us explain why we favor fascist and populist leaders in times of existential anxiety. Also helps us explain why we're uncomfortable with our bodies and with nature. We've done experiments where we've shown that when you remind people that they're going to die, they don't like admitting that humans are animals. After all, animals die. And they don't like nature. There's a group of researchers in Holland where they showed people pictures of like forests or just neighborhoods with lawns and fences. And they're like, well, which do you like better? Well, under normal conditions, people prefer to look at nature, but when they're reminded of death first, then they don't care for nature. It makes them distinctly uncomfortable. Moreover, when people are reminded that they're going to die, it makes them more prone to greedily exploit the natural environment by overusing non-renewable resources. Right? And of course, you can't even think about how we're destroying the environment if we don't also think about human beings' insatiable desire for money and shopping. I'm going to guess that there's still stores over in Europe, although not as many as here. And so, but the point is that, and this is an important one for Becker, and it's actually a point that John Locke, the Scottish philosopher, made in the 1690s when he said, look, any natural desire, there's an upper limit, and then you've had enough. So you might love apples, but after 5 apples, you're like, you know what, I've had enough apples. Or you might like beer, and you're like, wow, after 12 beers, I've had enough. You fill in your favorite thing, chocolate, sex, whatever you want. There still comes a point where you're like Mary Poppins, enough is as good as a feast. But there's 2 things where people never have enough. We never have enough money, and we never have enough stupid shit that we don't need. And what Becker argued is that anytime there are desires that can never be satisfied, you should assume that death anxiety underlies them. Again, I like Cat on a Hot Tin Roof. You guys may be a little too young. A play by Tennessee Williams, where the main character, Big Daddy, at the end, he's like, the human animal is a beast that dies. And if he's got money, he buys and he buys and he buys. And I think the reason that he buys everything that he can buy is that in the back of his mind, he's got the crazy hope that one of his purchases will be life everlasting. And that's what our studies show. If you remind people they're going to die, they want more money, they're more attracted to high status luxury items like fancy watches and cars. If you ask them to draw pictures of money, they draw bigger coins and bills as if money is larger on their minds when they're thinking about death. And then the most compelling study was done by some Polish colleagues. They just had people either count a stack of money or count a stack of plain pieces of paper. You didn't get to keep anything. You just like, here, count some money or count some paper. And then they measured death anxiety. Just having money in your hand was sufficient to reduce death anxiety, thus establishing that money is much more than a neutral symbol to mediate the exchange of goods and services. All right, one more area, and then I think we'll be able to get to the present moment, and that is that these ideas help us understand why we have epidemic levels of psychological disorders. I'll just speak in the U.S., where about 1/3 of the population is either currently depressed or will be depressed at some point in their lives. Got another 1/3 is addicted to drugs and alcohol, and the other 1/3's watching Netflix, or they're in their sport utility vehicle driving 30 miles to Walmart to save $1 on a machine gun and a lemon. And the point is that these levels of psychological disorders are 10 times higher than in the aftermath of World War II. And what Becker said is, look, anytime you have wholesale levels of psychological dis-ease, and I don't mean that in the medical sense, so put a hyphen between dis and ease, what you need to think about is whether or not the standards of value that prevail in the culture at a given time are realistically attainable for the average individual. And so in the US, if you're a male, for example, you're only valuable if you've got a lot of money. President Trump has said that. If you're poor, you're a loser, right? But in our country, only a few people can be very successful financially because their riches are dependent on literally hundreds of millions of people that are pretty much condemned to work where they will never be fiscally successful. Women have it even worse. You're supposed to be successful financially, and you have to be thinner than a piece of linguine, and you can never get more than maybe 25 years old before you're a desiccated piece of dried fruit. So the point that Becker makes is that we live in a society where we are dooming our children to psychological despair by asking them to embrace standards of value that are not realistically attainable. All right, well, so what in a nutshell? Well, the point is that what our research suggests is that reminders of mortality, at least in the way that we produce them in our studies, surely do bring out the worst in us. You know, they turn us into demoralized, hateful, warmongering proto-fascists plundering the planet in our insatiable quests for money and stuff, in a kind of Facebook, alcohol, Twittering, Netflix stupor. And so what? Well, what does this mean now that we're in the midst of the pandemic? Well, after September 11th, Jeff and Tom and I were asked to write a book by the American Psychological Association, and we wrote a book. It's called In the Wake of 9/11, The Psychology of Terror. And what we said in that book is, look, September 11th is like a giant mortality salience induction. Instead of coming into the lab, you just have to have your eyes open. We're surrounded by intimations of mortality. And so what we predicted is that everything that we had found in our studies, we would find in real life. And sure enough, within days of 9/11, Americans were loving patriotic Americans and hating and killing anything that appeared to have anything to do with Islam. Within days of 9/11, gambling was way up, drinking was way up, drug use was way up. Within days of 9/11, support for President George W. Bush was way up. Within days of 9/11, rates of all previously existing psychological disorders also way up. And by the way, we've done dozens of studies showing that death reminders amplify all pre-existing conditions that we've studied so far. So spider phobics become more afraid of spiders if you remind them of death. Obsessive compulsive people use more soap and water to wash their hands. Socially anxious people hide in closets more. People who are prone to trauma show higher levels of psychological dissociation. All right, so now let's finally get to today in the coronavirus. Well, I would predict that this pandemic will produce the same magnification of all of these non-optimal defensive reactions to death anxiety that we have found in 40 years of our studies. And I see no evidence so far that statement is not true. All right, let me stop there for a second. Thoughts, comments, questions?
Yes, we had a question from Erica. So she was asking, can you speak to prosperity gospel and how a pastor can amass riches and still direct people, in America at least, to give their stimulus checks rather than taking care of themselves?
Well, it's the same thing. Yes, I can. It's no different. And that, by the way, that's a great question. So the prosperity gospel, it's the same thing as people's allegiance to any charismatic leader. So I recommend a book by a guy named Eric Hoffer, who in 1951, it's a book called The True Believer. And what Hoffer said, and he wasn't being cynical, he was just like, look, when people are in psychological distress, when there's economic and psychological insecurity, that we need to glob onto something. And folks who are high in authoritarianism, so this is an individual personality difference. And remember, there's two kinds of authoritarians. There are the sadistic types, the Hitlers and the Trumps of the world that want to dominate other people. And then there are the masochistic types. And this doesn't refer to sexuality per se, although it can. Eric Fromm extended the idea of sadism and masochism to render them broad constructs. The masochistic individual needs to submit to someone else's higher authority. Right, and so and what Hoffer says is that's why when people submit to a higher authority, they become impervious to truth and reason. And by the way, they prove that Abraham Maslow was wrong. I suspect a lot of you are familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where you have to eat. And then if you've eaten, then you want friends. And if you have friends, you want self-esteem and so on. Well, no, Trump has proven, along with Hitler and other populist types, that that's backwards. Americans will happily starve because Trump has made them proud to be white. Right. Same thing with the prosperity therapists, because this is a perverse and malignant manifestation and this back to Max Weber, the Protestant work ethic. You guys, I'm sure, because you're in Europe, so you're literate and will know this, unlike the folks on my end of the ocean. But Weber was like, how come people, the Puritan mentality where you keep working and working and working long after you already have enough stuff? And the answer that Weber gave was that it's the doctrine of predestination. According to Protestant theology, you're either damned or blessed the moment that you're born, and you can't do anything about it, but you can get some hint of God's intentions towards you by how successful you are on earth. And so the more money and shit that you have, that means that God is shining his countenance upon you. All right, back to prosperity theology. And so here you have these people, and they're all criminals, by the way, because they're interested not in anyone else's salvation but their own. And basically, they're like, God wants you to be rich. And what they really mean is that God wants me to be rich. And for me to be rich, you have to send me all of your stuff. And people will do that happily, just like they'll send money to President Trump, who is about to take away their health insurance, in part because we worship the aura of power. And we have this vague sense that if somebody else is fantastically successful, that we're going to be immune to death anxiety by just being one of their supporters. In fact, one of our colleagues did a study where she asked people to imagine being on a plane that either had a famous actor on it or not, And when there was somebody famous on the plane, people thought the plane was less likely to crash. So my long-winded answer is that money is the new God, and God's malevolent mouthpieces on earth are trying to enrich themselves by parlaying the dependence of their followers into riches for them. And yeah, only in America could you have a world view of that nature that can be used in the same sentence with Christianity without Jesus coming back and incinerating the entire planet.
Thank you, Sheldon. We have a couple more questions. There is a question from Kate, who is asking, does experiencing the death of a loved one during childhood or adolescence influence death and anxiety?
Ooh, Kate, that is an excellent question. And the answer, well, all right, let me be provisional. To my knowledge, there is no literature that gives us an unambiguous response to that question. But I can't imagine that it doesn't matter, if that makes sense. So my wife, Maureen, is a bereavement counselor for the local hospice, and she works with children who have lost significant others. And clearly it has a substantial effect on what happens to them thereafter, but it's not uniform. I don't want to, I hate that. I'm not sure I like the word resilience because it implies that the absence thereof is some kind of character flaw. But some folks react, even at a very early age, quite differently than others. I'm not sure if we have a handle on what might predict one outcome as opposed to another. But that just means that your question is a good one that requires a lot more empirical study. Anything else, Anna?
Yes, there are a couple more. So next question, and actually there is like a couple. Why should the individual resist this? Why not engage in willful repression and avoid anxiety? And I don't know. If you want, I can read the second question, or
yeah, could you say that again?
It's from the yes. Why should the individual resist this? Why not engage in willful repression and avoid anxiety?
Oh, okay.
And what can we do as an individual to wake up others to this realization? That is, how can we help reduce the negative social impacts of death and anxiety for others?
Yeah. Oh, no. All right. So I'm going to be a little silly. I might have said something like this, Anna, when we were together at the conference, but like all great questions, if I could answer that, I would be drinking rum out of a coconut with my Nobel Prize on the beach, because I do think, I'm glad the question arose. So I like Albert Camus' take on this. In his notebook somewhere, Camus scribbled, "Come to terms with death, thereafter anything is possible." And maybe that's a high bar, but the point that Camus was making is that we can make headway with regard to confronting our existential anxieties head on. And I believe that the future of humankind will depend on whether or not we're able to do that individually and collectively. If you think about our studies, the death reminders are not direct. You know, you're standing in front of a funeral parlor. The word death is being flashed on a TV screen. You're asked to write about your own death, but you're not in any imminent physical danger. And when that happens, and this is a long story, Um, and by the way, anybody that when we get done talking, Anna knows how to find me. If you have questions, feel free to email me. If you got too much free time, I'd be happy to send you a PDF file of our book about this stuff and we have a chapter at the end of the book called "Living with Death," where we try and think about these ideas as extensively as we can. But our point in the book is, yeah, if all you do whenever death comes to mind is actively repress it, if you bury your fears under the psychological bushes, well, they're going to come back to bear malignant fruit. But that's very different than the traditions in philosophy and religion that go back to antiquity, which say that in order to live a good life, we have to come to terms with the fact that it will someday end. All right, so you had Socrates who said to philosophize is to learn how to die. All right, then you've got all of the religious traditions. We've got the Tibetan book of death. We got the medieval monks that worked with the skulls on their desks. And none of this was because of any morbid preoccupation with death, so much as to get us to the point where we accept death in a way that allows us to more fully live. So since I was with Anna a bit, and I can't remember, Anna, if this was from talking to you or some of the other conferees, it was one of the best conferences I've ever been to, by the way. Honestly, I'm very glib about some of these things, like actually really smart people thinking about things. And somebody told me that I needed to read Heidegger's Being and Time. And, I'm like, he's a fucking Nazi. I'm not going to read that book. But I did. And he is a Nazi, but Nazis are people too. And I like Heidegger's point, which is that if we are able to come to terms with death anxiety, then all of a sudden, and I like Heidegger's language because he calls it like a turning. He's like, yeah, death anxiety is repellent. We tend to flee from it. And Heidegger uses a Kierkegaardian term, tranquilizing ourselves with the trivial. So that's the bad news when we try to escape anxiety. But then he says, yeah, but let's turn things around metaphorically and let's look at it a different way where anxiety serves as a calling. And it is a calling from ourselves to ourselves, summoning us to recognize the reality of the human condition, which is that all of us are born in a time and place not of our choosing, subject to cultural and historical contingencies over which we have no control. Like none of us are choosing to be reduced to virtual entities stuck in our houses right now. But Heidegger's point is that you realize that despite all of those boundary conditions, the one thing that is universal is you. You're still you. And you still have what Heidegger described as the possibility of possibilities. And if you have the courage to accept the responsibility for choosing, I like how Jean-Paul Sartre put it, we're condemned to choose. Then Heidegger says it makes us, he calls it anticipatory resoluteness, that makes us solicitous towards our fellow humans. So anticipatory, we look forward to the future. Resolute, we are determined in the most commendable way to carry on. We're solicitous, we care about the people around us. And then my favorite line, fucking at the end of a 1,000-page book, is when he says, if you make it through the end of my book without dying, then you get to this point where life becomes an ongoing adventure perfused with unshakable joy. I just love that idea. And I'm like, dude, this was even before hallucinogens. So he's doing this in the 1920s. But I find this quite uplifting because here we are in the middle of a pandemic. It is clearly when my parents used to tell me about growing up in the Depression and World War II and the Holocaust, I was like, oh, dudes, that must have sucked. But, thankfully, we're on the inexorable road to progress, so things will never be like that again. All right, but here we are. They are like that again. And while this will surely bring out the worst in many of us, it can also bring out the best in us. Any of you all know Camus' book, The Plague? My students are sick of me at Skidmore because I made them read The Plague after the plague. And I'm like, all right, I get it. You don't want to read it. So just read the last sentence where Camus says, we learn in times of pestilence that there is more to admire in mankind than to despise. And I was like, wow, dude, I hope you're right. Because to me, this is our only hope. It was Nietzsche's hope also. Some of you know Nietzsche, the gay science, the famous phrase, God is dead, where he then goes on to point out that things were going to be quite unsettled for 200 years or so. And while that will surely be unpleasant to a large chunk of Earth, it is also the case, even if this sounds like a cliche, that sometimes things have to hit rock bottom before we're in a position to collectively engage in fairly radical transformations that render us all better than we might have been before. And I know that maybe this sounds naive, and I know it's naive because I'm one of the small minority of people on Earth that the worst thing that can happen to me is that I'll be sitting in my house and sharing some cat food with my pets, but I'll have a place to sleep tonight and I'll have some food while there is food. A lot of the people on Earth don't have that luxury, but for those of us that do, I think we're in a uniquely pivotal position to be able to exploit the vagaries of the moment, not only for our own individual psychological benefit, but I hope in ways that are going to have wholesale effects on the world around us. And if that makes me kind of a hippie throwback from the Woodstock days, then so be it.
Thank you very much, Sheldon. We have one more question.
Go.
So Ali is asking, have you any research on the impact of the current crisis on the perspective of neurodiversity, ASD on DA?
Ooh. I'm not sure I got that one. Say that one more time. Okay, wait a minute. No. Okay, so that's a fine question and an incredibly important one. All I can say is that we have students of ours who are clinicians that are eager to look at that. So this might be right to me in a bit, and I'll tell you if I have anything more to add on that front.
Yes. Okay. One more question just came in. So how can we separate the genuine confrontation with death from the dangers of transformation of a project of death, confrontation, or awareness into another avoidance strategy?
Oh God. Okay. That's another high dollar question. And what I suggest in the interest of time, whoever asked that question or anybody else who's interested, please write to me so that I can do more than the fortune cookie response that I'm about to emit. The short answer is that this is indeed difficult. It is an important and thorny question, but there are ways to get at it empirically. And what it has to do with there is to, if folks have had a genuine confrontation with mortality, then if they were to be in our experiments again, where let's say they were reminded of death subliminally, they shouldn't react in as defensive a way. I don't know if that makes sense, but like, so for example, if you have genuinely come to terms with your mortality, and then we remind you a year later that you're going to die, you shouldn't sit further away from somebody just because they look different, or hate them because they don't share your political views. I hope that makes sense as a preliminary response, but that question is too good to be this short. That's a high dollar question. Or maybe I can come back another time and we can do another stint. I'm always looking for opportunities to exchange ideas, and so maybe
Sure.
we could do that, Anna.
Sure. I mean, and also we, I don't know what if you are constrained with time, but we can definitely go on for longer if people are having more ideas and questions.
Yeah, I'm not going anywhere till 20.
I think we have another question from Elena.
Hello.
Or yes.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi.
Yes.
Hi, Sheldon.
Hello.
Hi, everyone. Very good seeing you again. From Copenhagen to your presentation in New York in 2018. And
yeah.
you know, I have this book here. Yeah.
There it is.
Yes.
My cousins have it also, so now we've sold like 5 of them.
You know, it seems like we need to have a special education, like optimistic death education, something like that. You know, I think it's maybe one of the life skills that we need to actually to cultivate.
Absolutely.
Maybe from the beginning rather than end.
Yes.
And there is a research about how real presence of imminent danger or conscious awareness of death, illness, this awareness of short future, how it can restructure the values, the choice of friends, and really creating more meaning. But it happens later. And
yes.
I remember there was one author, Rabbi Liebman. He said that the death is a friend. It's very hard to conceptualize that
yes.
it can be a friend. So it's just a thought. And also, I gave a talk last week here, and you know, I have an anecdotal evidence of my caseload, which is of course not a sample, but I was really somehow encouraged to see this capacity to exhibit more strength, and I would say lessening of symptoms rather than escalation of symptoms.
Yes.
It's not yet, the pandemic is going on, so it can be a variation.
Right.
But that was my observation that I shared. So just like wanted to get your comment on that.
No, very good. You know, to be silly, I defer to people who are actually working directly with and helping others. And this gets back to, I think, an important distinction between what we do as researchers and what you do, the people that are really helping other folks. You're noticing a wider range of responses. And yeah, we need to pay more attention to, and to be able to study more rigorously some of the more beneficial and virtuous reactions to these kinds of conditions. I don't mean to sound defensive here, but I read a book 40 years ago at a time when we were interested in understanding a lot of things that people did that were not particularly pleasant. And I'm, I'm kind of tottering on the threshold of senility, but I'm a little sick of death. And now I want to study how we can aikido these existential concerns into more life-affirming opportunities. And so, yes, very good point. Good to see you again. I hope we'll be in person at some point.
Mhm. Yeah, there are a couple more questions that are coming in. I don't know. Mark, would you like to ask your question yourself, or should I read it out?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi,
Okay.
Mark.
Hi, Sheldon. The safe money right now is that the Trump administration is going to capitalize, either deliberately or through incompetence, on pandemic death anxiety.
Oh, yeah.
And my thought is that most Americans, and probably most of the world, pretty fed up with the clown and the string pulling that's been going on. What I'm curious about is whether you could speculate on any possible psychological antidotes, kind of in keeping with what Elena just asked.
Yeah, wow. No, I can't, except for relentless efforts on those of us that are here in the U.S. And I know it sounds naive because I've given up on the base of Trump's support. They won't change under any circumstances. And everything that Trump now does is to, as Steve Bannon puts it, facts don't drive people to the polls, fear and anger does. And nothing that he does has any interest whatsoever in helping people. This is all about enhancing his electoral prospects. But I still think it's important that what I tell my students is, look, you need to stay engaged. You need to stay informed. We need to be able to have respectful and civil disagreements with people who don't share our views. Mm-hmm. And no, I'm at a loss right now. But it sounds foolish when I say that I am quite confident that if we didn't have a pandemic and a depression happening at the same time, that he would win handily because of the electoral college. I think he will lose by 10 million votes, and it'll still be a nail biter in the election.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
My pleasure.
And there is one more question from Alan.
Right.
Do you see universities ever becoming less anesthetized by postmodernism and more integral and cross-cutting between disciplines?
No, but I hope so. Now, again, to sound silly, if you had asked me this question 6 months ago, I would be confident that that answer is no. But maybe it's this kind of crisis. I don't know what effect this will have on education in Europe, but it will, I think, has already destroyed higher education in the US, whether we know it or not. And I've been arguing for 40 years, not that it makes me right, but I have said that liberal arts education in the United States prepares students for a world that never existed and renders them completely unprepared for the world that they're about to encounter. And, the little school that I work at in New York is falling apart, but I've been pushing. I'm like, we need to radically overhaul the curriculum. And in my world, it would be a transdisciplinary effort to maintain the best elements of classical education with what we need to do. And so I'm if it were my school, I'd be plowing under most of Skidmore's golf courses to make it a farm so we could try and grow all the food that we need in order to be self-sufficient. We have wonderful landscaping, but we don't have a single fruit tree on our campus. It's like, why can't we plant fruit trees instead of other flowering trees? Why can't everybody who comes to school, sure, they can have an academic major, but why not also be required to have a vocational skill? Why can't I be a psychology major and an electrician? So I think, and remembering, and I don't want to sound glib, but the pandemic is a transitory minor inconvenience compared to the decades, if not millenniums, of distress that will befall us just from climate change in the next 10 years. So this is a practice run. We'll either adjust or be just rendered completely irrelevant. And that was a great question.
Going very fast. Yes. Now I'm losing. Wait. Yes, I see a comment. But I don't know your Brian. Brian, would you like to audio your comments?
Sure. So my question is, I agree with you that I've given up on Trump supporters too, or that core group that you can't change their mind with facts. And I think I'm less likely, if I went into a room and experiment, to sit next to somebody with a Make America Great hat on. But I worry somehow that I might become identified with my own intolerance. So my question is essentially that: how is that act of giving up different from the us versus them thinking that we're trying to avoid?
Yeah, awesome and very fine question. And by the way, Brian, is that your name?
Yeah.
Great question, Brian. So we're doing MAGA hat studies now because what I want to show is that they are, for Trump supporters, it's no different than a crucifix.
Right.
And I would identify myself as you do. For me, it's no different than a swastika or a Ku Klux Klan robe. So we're trying to show that the hats are psychodynamically loaded. And I'm not saying I'm good at this yet, and I may sound a little defensive, but there is an asymmetry here. One of the things that bothers me in the U.S. is when people with strong opinions, it's like, yeah, you're pro-Trump and I'm anti-Trump. And so these are two different ends of the same continuum. The difference is that on one end is a deference to ideas and a willingness to alter one's opinion in light of the facts. Now, we're all motivated reasoners. So the fact of the matter is that, and it was Reinhold Niebuhr, the great Protestant theologian, that said this in the 1920s, you can always build a case for your preferred position by working backwards. And a lot of people are very good at doing that. But the primary difference, the way I see it, is that and a lot of folks have noticed this, and that is that people who support the president will under no circumstances change their minds about him. They will bend any fact or idea to render it in accord with their support for the president. And I guess my point is, and I'm trying to have it both ways, because we live in a very Republican town. Our neighbors are all red hats. We've been here for 30 years. I get on fine with them. And we've agreed to disagree about a lot of things. But the main thing that I've been urging us all to consider is to remember our superordinate identity as Americans and humans. And that because it is back in the old days, not to sound like Father Time, but we used to live in integrated neighborhoods, not racially, but politically, where you would have people of varying opinions in proximity to each other, and where you can have very serious and yet playful discussions about policy differences. This is very hard to do these days, and I'm kind of blubbering, but I try and be very careful to distinguish between policy differences and what I think is the bigger concern right now, which is between freedom and fascism. Now, you don't win debates this way, but what I say to my Republican friends is, look, any Republican will render the earth unfit for human habitation and take food out of the mouths of children and the elderly. So, but you can do that without being a vulgar, sadistic, vindictive, pathologically narcissistic, sociopathic, racist, misogynist, functionally illiterate, pussy-grabbing, twittering Mussolini. So this is not about Republican versus Democrat. It's you've cast your lot with Orange Hitler, and we're now at a point where there's a fork in the road. I really haven't answered your question. I've just made it worse because I went from try to be benevolent and engaged to like, wow, it's pretty hard right now. So,
thank you. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I didn't do anything, but thanks for the question, Brian.
Great discussions. Any other questions? I see Erica is posting a question. How does one cope with people choosing the economy over life?
Wow. Erica, that's a good question. I don't know. Kill them? I'm being silly. Is this Erica who I know? Is that? Anyway.
Erica
Hi,
Campbell,
Erica.
but I don't know.
I
Erica,
do know her.
would you like
Anyway.
to voice yourself?
Yeah, all right. I do know Erica. It's a great question. Again, these are hard discussions to have these days. I would just point out, as a lot of folks do, including Ernest Becker, from which our ideas are based, and that's that, the economy is an abstraction. Money is an abstraction. If you don't believe me, try to eat some. I always, in my classes, I'm like, what do you want, $10 or a carrot? And they're always like, oh, $10. Don't be a fucking idiot. I'm like, well, I'll take $10 if I'm in a mountain range without toilet paper, but otherwise I want a carrot. And I think that, and this gets back to Elena's fine point earlier about we need to teach people about things a whole lot earlier in life. We've got it backwards. Weber, Max Weber, his idea about the gilded cage, where he said, look, and this is a Marxist idea, but a lot of people have said it, which is that let's not denounce the material benefits that capital-based economies have afforded all of us. And Marx said this, Weber said this, and that for a lot of human history, the accumulation of capital, it did have problematic byproducts, but it did lift all boats, as it were. But over time, in Weber's language, what used to serve us, we now serve it. So we now have it backwards. So here and again, for those of you that are not in the United States, I don't know if you see this every day, and it would be funny if it wasn't happening, because literally right now, the dominant political discourse is that the actual death of people is inconsequential when it comes to the health of the economy, which is itself an abstraction. So we've gotten to the point of delusion where we value the abstractions more than we do the reality that supposedly underlies them. But that doesn't answer the question. But that's a good one, Erica.
There is another question from Sarah. But Sarah, would you like to maybe voice it over?
Let me trying to figure this out.
Well, we can hear you.
I hear you, Sarah.
Hello.
I don't know how to use this thing either yet. I'm going to work on it for when I. Hi, Sarah.
Hi. So first, I just finished reading your book, The Worm at the Core, earlier this week. It was really excellent. I enjoyed it so much.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. So my question is, I guess, more philosophical. So you've talked a bit about, like truth and how we come to know what we understand. So my question is, do you believe that objective truth exists? And if so, how do we balance knowing that you're like an isolated consciousness in a breathing, defecating, meaty machine, and not falling prey to what you call intellectual fascism or scientism?
Yeah, I don't. And that this no, very, very fine question. The experimentalist in me was trained was trained in a materialist tradition that subscribes to the view that there is objective truth, while at the same time humbly acknowledging that human beings wouldn't know if they fell on top of it.
Okay.
So and I find that position appealing. On the one hand, there is such a thing as truth, while on the other hand, we do not have the epistemological machination to know unambiguously when we found it. We can unambiguously rule out the not true, however. That's the positivist view that I was taught. Having said that, I am increasingly, as I've gotten older and understand less of what the physicists are now doing,
Mm-hmm.
and then having suffered through the Nazi Heidegger, not only being in time, but like 10 other books, and I cannot with a straight face tell you that I understand Heidegger's arguments yet. But I think what he's saying is we can't even philosophically justify the claim that there's any such thing as objective truth. I like another dude, Otto Rank, who wrote a book called Truth and Reality. And, Rank's view is that, the truth, that's for when you're at a bar trying to impress people, but it has so little to do with reality that maybe we should think in other terms. Anyway, that's just a great question.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have one more question coming in from Alan. Alan, would you like to voice it over? Alan Beck?
Hi. Hey, Sheldon, it's Alan, the guy with the badge, with the numbers.
Oh, hi, Alan.
So listen, I want to ask a really simple question. How does time perspective research enhance our use of terror management theory for you?
Oh, okay. Awesome question. What we've now done, and this is because of I was profoundly moved intellectually as well as just psychosocially by the gathering that we had when I was privileged to be part of it last time around. That is honestly, I was like, to sound silly, I went to the Time conference and I was like, I don't have time for time. And I was like, well, I need to make time And now, having read Being in Time and now getting a bit more acquainted with the work of the people that I met at the conference, we, terror management theory, it's just a theory. And like all theories, it is productive to the extent that it draws your attention to areas of inquiry that are interesting and productive. And all theories are also problematic distractions by virtue of systematically closing off other areas of inquiry. And there's nothing in the way that our theory was originally framed that would draw our attention to two issues surrounding time. And that's to our discredit, because in Becker's, one of his very first books, The Birth and Death of Meaning, he defines humanity. He calls us time-binding animals. So my long-winded short answer is it has not yet informed and enriched our work, but it needs to. I know from a recent gathering of the terror management theory and research people that there's a lot of young folks, and of course this is what makes science exciting and vibrant, who want to step in and start looking at things from a temporal perspective, and I think that's going to be good.
That's great. Also, so I think it was also like an interesting theory to look at, and it's for me it's like it's very much connected to time.
Well, of course.
Because also if we kind of like if we see ourselves also finite or not unfinite, and so like what is like is that is kind of like bringing in us, and we are doing now a very interesting project in terms of how people imagine their future. And we had a small discussion with the students, because when we would ask them in terms of how do they imagine their personal future, and so they're very excited and they have very positive ideas and what they want to achieve, whom they want to become. Then we ask them, what about the global future? And they see like a very negative picture kind of like unfolding: mass human extinction, climate changes and catastrophes and everything. And the next question is like, what is the timeline for both? It's the same. They believe it's the same between 15 to 30 years, at least for people who are from United States. And so for me, this was kind of like, so how can people plan for their personal success and kind of see it as a positive scenario unfolding, when at the same time they believe that the world is doomed and it's going to happen at the same time frame? And there is a few answers when we were interviewing students. I mean, it's very much related to the terror management theory. So there is a big link.
Well, I think there is. Yes, we have lots more to do.
Yes. There is another question from Karen. Karen, would you like to voice it over, or should I ask it?
Yeah, I'll ask it. Hi, I just wanted to say hello. I've read your book and did my master's thesis on terror management theory and psychological disorders. So,
wow,
awesome to finally hear you talk in person. So my master's degree was in thanatology, and ironically, the subject of terror management theory rarely came up, or Becker's work of the denial of death, or any kind of sociological anthropologist or anything like that. So there's a very heavy focus on bereavement counseling, the funeral care industry, but not really the aspect of how death affects us as a social and psychological manner. So you said that your wife also works in hospice for bereavement. I've done the same thing as well. And so I'm curious to know, after studying a lot about complicated bereavement and different types of helping people grieve, whether it's through meaning making, storytelling, things like that, do you think there would be a benefit in approaching the way in helping people grieve through the lens of facing their own immortality or facing their own mortality?
Well, yeah, great question. I think that my sense when I look at what the bereavement folks do is that they are doing precisely that. That is helping people confront their own mortality, even if the word death never arises. So I like, Rollo May and Yalom when they write about existential psychotherapy, and they talk about the universal existential concerns, and they're like, yeah, there's death, there's choice and responsibility, there's isolation, and then there's meaninglessness. And what Rollo May and Yalom say is, no, it's not like a cookbook where you have to hit each of these categories, because people being very different, their existential concerns may manifest in very different ways. And so what my wife tells me is that, for some people, they're concerned about their own mortality and they know that. And so with them, the best approach therapeutically may be to engage them at that level. Other folks, you may sense that that's what that concerns them, but that may be best addressed through meaning making, narratizing. Sure. My daughter's a therapist also, and one of the things that gives me great hope for therapy is that I see less and less talking. Not that that's not central. Talking in the discursive sense, and more recognition of the value of stories, the value of artistic expression, the value of breathing deeply, the value of gratitude, humility, just anything that in any way appeals to those concerns, even if they're not made explicit. So that would be my short answer.
Yeah. Thank you.
That's a great question.
Yes. And we have one more question from Ksenia, and maybe this will be a concluding question for our session today, because we are
very good.
Quite.
Hi, Sheldon. Do you remember me from Copenhagen?
Yes, from Russia.
Yes, yes. I was talking about doctors then.
Yes.
So I was just wondering. It was very interesting to know that your wife works with grieving, actually, and you make quite a couple together, I guess. I mean, with working directly with people who experience death of close others, and thinking about death in just abstract way. But what I think, as far as I know, the theory, the terror management theory, is that you did, that your group did quite a work and found out that not only self-esteem and worldview is important to the terror management, but also some other things like, for example, relationship and attachment and what else? And Konstantin Siddiqui just worked with nostalgia, for example. And what I am thinking about is just when you said that people get really disappointed when they are reminded that they are no less important than a potato or a dog. I'm quite okay with that. I mean that when you think about it from the point of view of abstraction, probably it is abusive to tell a person that you're no less than a potato. But from the thing of life itself, it's quite amazing to be like any other living, breathing, and other type of living being. So my question is, it's not a question actually. It's just a sort of it's a question because what do you actually think about this research as well? And also there is a sort of feedback about and reminding you about Becker's ideas of super ordinate science and superordinate the need for some constructions in society to make more meanings and values that overlap with lots of people, so that make them more connected.
All right. So great points. We'll talk for a couple of seconds, and then we can carry on from distance. Yeah. So there are a lot more components to terror management processes that have been studied and that need to be studied, particularly secure attachments. I also agree with your very broad notion, if I understand it, and that is that and this is Rollo May's point in his fine book, The Cry for Myth, is like what we are lacking today are compelling myths in the sense that the term myth was originally designed to embrace, which is overriding narratives that render reality meaningful and compelling in ways that unite as many of us as possible without dividing us. Yeah, I think that should be very top of humanity's to-do list. Yeah, let's do that.
It's a tricky thing to do, but yeah, it would be great.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you very much, everybody. I think it's been a very lively session today. Lots of questions, lots of very interesting answers. More questions to ask and find more meaningful answers to those. And it seems like also this session somehow brought in some researchers who were not really aware of each other. So that's also great.
And so this is great. And again, I know I said this already, but please don't be bashful. You know how to use the internet. I'm in the psychology department at Skidmore College. Most of our research over the years is because of people like you. What about this? What about that? I don't mind being wrong. All theories are wrong, so don't feel compelled to agree with me about anything. And please. This has been kind of a one-way street with me yelping your way, but I've gotten a sense that your collective interests and pursuits are useful on my end. So, yeah, please don't be bashful. Send me questions. If you want to see any of our research, I'll send it to you. If you have things that you're working on, please send it to me. And let's see this as I hope not the last time that we get to interact, although I do sincerely hope we get an in the flesh intersection at some point.
Yes.
Thank you.
And I think also if there is also more interest, I mean, we can always organize a follow-up session with you, Sheldon, or just, I mean, so that we have, I I see some people nodding. So
yeah, I'll be happy to. Thank you, Anne,
to do that. And yes, so thank you so much, everybody, for today. This has been recorded. I think there was a question about this. And so if nobody minds, we will put it up on the YouTube, on the Time Perspective Network channel. And so also you can see some of the previous talks. And also please feel free to reach out if you have some other ideas of the topics and the people that we can now conversate with. It's kind of like it's, although we are all isolated, but we can still be together. And I think it's been lovely so far.
Well, thank you, everybody. Have a great day.
So thank you so much once again.
Bye now.
Thank you.